Kia ora, and welcome to the Rainbow Umbrella, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything under the rainbow. Today, I'm once again joined by Professor Chris Brickell to talk about his fabulous new book, Lord Diaries, which has just come out. Personally, I've been waiting all year to talk about this with you, so it's great that it's finally time. Welcome, Chris. It's great to have you back again.
Kia ora, Mel. It's nice to be here.
This is very exciting. I don't even know where to start with this kōrero, as there are so many fabulous things that we could discuss. I guess we'll start with what drew you personally to Robert Lord. What was it about him and his work that appealed to you?
Okay, so this book's a little bit different to some of my previous ones in that it came about because I had an approach from one of the people, Lord Diaries, who actually is one of the editors of the book, along with Vanessa Manhire. So the three of us have worked on this together. Mm-hmm. And Nanita rang me up one day and she said, well, you've done the Courage Diaries, would you like to do Robert Lord? And I didn't know much about Robert Lord at all. Mm-hmm. I knew that there was an extensive archive of his in the Hocken in Dunedin, so that was a really good starting point. I think too, I not only did I not know much about him, I knew he lived in Dunedin for a while, and I knew that he died of AIDS in the early 1990s, but that was more or less all, and I knew nothing about his plays, none of which I had seen, although my partner Jeffrey had been involved in a production of Joyful and Triumphant in Dunedin.
Oh, no way!
Not long after we'd arrived in the early 2000s, so there was actually a bit of a family connection with him.
I love that.
So there's the connection there. I really got into reading the diaries, and then I read over 20 of his plays. So I think there are about 25, 26, 27 radio plays and stage plays. And of course, I went looking for the queer themes, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more soon. So this was an instance of starting a project on somebody I didn't know much about at all. But then I read the diaries, and the diaries are amazing. And I read the plays, and the plays are some of the queerest things you'll see in the history of New Zealand theatre, and no one had told me this.
Amazing.
So, very exciting project, and a really, really interesting person.
So, I personally enjoyed reading about the places, people, and events that were not only recognisable because of his time in Dunedin, but of a more contemporary time period than Courage. Like the historian in me loved the Courage stuff, but this was cool because I could recognise it. I also particularly enjoyed the multiple Bowie references. That was an amazing surprise. So what was your favourite thing about working with not only a queer author, but a more contemporary author?
Well, one of the things that was particularly special about this is that we made contact with some of his friends. Mm-hmm. And so being able to talk to people who were friends with Robert and knew him really well, and most of them really, really, really loved him. So that was really touching and sweet, and also fantastic because some of them provided photographs. And so we have photos from the collections of three of his friends in the book. Russell Craig, who's a former lover who now lives in London, and Bobby Miller and Alex Ely, who both live in New York. Mm-hmm. And so talking to them about Robert was amazing. And that helped us layer up the whole element of Robert as a recent person, but somebody who people we now know, knew and loved, and who had collected and kept mementos of him. So that was a particularly special element of working on a project with somebody who was born in 1946 and died in 1991 and would have been in their 70s now if they were still alive. So completely feasible kind of lifespan, and someone whose friends are still alive. And Nonita and Vanessa contacted quite a number. The acknowledgements page has got them all, and there might be 30 in there. So having that ability to talk to people who knew him, and Nonita knew him really, really well as well. She was a good friend of his. So this was a different project to Courage and some of my other projects because he's, as you say, kind of contemporary. And the Dunedin-ness I love too, that sense that Dunedin places are there in his narrative. And in fact, one of his plays, The Affair, which is set in Dunedin, features things like Centre City New World and the Guardies Tavern and the Captain Cook and Governors and so on. And so those kind of Dunedin places are there in his later work, as well as a play he never finished set in the English department at Otago University.
Yeah, that was really cool.
Which is really cool. So there's something, really freshly contemporary but also local about this. And then the material on New York, which is somewhere Vanessa has extensive experience of and I've never visited. So the geographical span is interesting to her.
Yeah, and I think that aspect of it is really quite appealing because even though, I've obviously been to Centre City New World, I have been to the Cook while it was still the Cook. But, places like Gardy's, I never went, but I recognise places like that. And, the English department, he talks about campus, he talks about his Titan Street place. And I'm like, I know where these places are. Yeah. And it's just so cool to be able to connect. And so I think the geographic elements of it will appeal to a wide range of readers because there'll be so much of it that people are like, oh yeah, I know about this, and it's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a readership here and elsewhere, that the book is very Robert Lord lived in Wellington from 1969-ish till 1974-ish, and so there's a fair bit of Wellington in there as well. He lived in Flat and Clifton Terrace, which will be familiar place to people who go to Victoria University. It's just downhill from there. Avalon TV Studios, Downstage Theatre, which existed until nearly 10 years ago, Circa Theatre, which is still going. So again, in Wellington, there are those kind of places. He mentions Christchurch, where he was really briefly, and driving around the empty streets at night with no one there. Well, that's kind of, still a bit of that. And in Auckland, his parents lived in Meadowbank, so he spent time living there as well. So there's a bit of kind of geographical spread for everybody. He went to high school in Hamilton and Invercargill. Yeah. So what New Zealand cities didn't he live in? He put on plays in Tauranga and Palmerston North. So there you go. I think just about
covered it. And I mean, he talks about his travels around the country as well. And, there are places that I may not have been to, but I know of. I'm like, oh, I know this place. It's quite cool.
Yeah, and he particularly adored the south of the South Island. So he wasn't from Dunedin. He did study at Otago University for a while, but he really loved living here later in his life. And there was a circuit, of course, which he took his visitors on, which went sort of around and through Queenstown, Te Anau, and up through Haast to Murchison, Nelson, and then sort of around and down. So he had a real affinity for the South Island, which he talks a bit about too.
So for me, there's almost kind of like a brain dump quality to the diaries that on first reading I found sometimes hard to keep up with, only because there were bits that I was obviously not as familiar with. So for you, how difficult was it not only to keep up, but to maybe track down like people and events to kind of make sense of the way that he was writing about them?
Well, I think the first thing to mention is that what's in the book is about half of the total. So we cut down the diaries by about half and tried to make sense of the narrative. Sometimes, again, when you do this, you edit things out that join bits together and so on. Not knowing much at all about the US made that a little bit tricky to kind of work out. He was coming and going a lot, and so there's a constant cutting backwards and forwards between New York and New Zealand, and that gave him a sense of being an outsider to both places, so the effect of mobility on identity is quite evident there. In terms of the theatre, that was a learning curve for me because I'm not a theatre historian, and so I wasn't familiar with his work, as I mentioned, so I was actually having to try and learn a bit about the theatre and what that meant, both as a social space and as a kind of a particular form of writing. So I felt myself going back to seventh form English, which was quite exciting. It was my best subject at secondary school. So it was like being back and reading Othello and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. So having to learn about theatre, but also that really exciting sense of discovering somebody's quite profound contribution to New Zealand cultural life. He's not as famous as his contemporary Roger Hall, who Robert knew quite well and was friends with, but he didn't think much of Hall's work. And so there was a sense in which he's been a little bit forgotten, except among those who knew him really well. among whom, he's fondly remembered. So I don't think I've answered the question, but I think in a sense, I agree with you about the brain dump quality of it. That there's an awful lot in there, and it spans a number of different kind of areas of interest. One of the things I found the most tricky, and readers of the intro will notice that there's not a lot on the time he spent in hospital at the end of his life, and there's a reason for that. I talked to a few people and had heard from quite a few people about the time he spent leading up to when he was admitted into Dunedin Hospital in 1991 and the time until he died. And people had really different memories of him at that point. And it was not possible to reconcile them. And so some people remembered him being really quite unwell, and others remembered him continuing to hope that he might still go to rehearsals for the next play and he might still be able to work. Some people felt that he was really reluctant to talk about having AIDS, and others didn't feel that was quite right. And there were people who found him in hospital to be really scary to them, and then others who didn't, because at that point, AIDS was kind of terrifying. Like, nobody knew where this whole thing was going and what it would mean. And so there were lots of different competing narratives. And in the end, I felt that really I had to just pare it right back to what we had agreed on, which is that he was very sick, practically delirious by the time he was admitted to hospital, and that people visited him. No one could even quite agree on who that was or what that meant or what his family thought. So there's a very spare analysis of that time in the introduction, the editorial introduction, simply because there was no coherent story.
And that's actually really interesting to me, because having only just read it myself and not knowing a huge amount about him, it was just like, where's the rest of it? And for me, it was more like, no, I feel like I've been on a journey with this person. And whilst I understand why things were cut, because it would be huge if it wasn't, there was still a part of me that's like, oh, but I know how this is ending, but I feel like there's a bit missing.
There certainly is a bit missing from the intro. I mean, I think I rewrote that about 7 times, and I couldn't get it right, and I sent it to people who had provided information, and they still weren't happy with the account in there. I think the other half of this issue is that his final diary is very, very short. So that the 1991 diary only has a few pages in it, and he didn't chronicle the last year or so of his life. And so the really pointy end isn't represented in his own writing. We leave him in the last diary where he's travelling to Christchurch for treatment for a brain tumour, and that's as far as we can get. In some ways, there's a whole lot of story here, I think, about what a really weird time the early 1990s were in terms of HIV and AIDS. And I remember this quite vividly within the gay community, that it was all just very, very weird and quite scary. And so I guess that, there's a certain lack of resolution there, which I think is irresolvable, probably, in a way. You'd almost need to find a way of people just telling their different stories of him and how they saw things. He didn't want to be an AIDS activist, really, but he also talks about going to an AIDS support group in Dunedin and being a bit disappointed that it wasn't more political. So I think that's in the diary somewhere. So it's a difficult topic to get a handle on, really, and something that he was fairly circumspect about writing about in his own writing.
I mean, he's very, with a lot of things, he's very open and forthright in the way that he talks about, the adventures he had and the things that he did and the people that he met and had relationships with and spent time with. And also he touches in the end on, more of the AIDS crisis and all of that sort of thing. And I found it really fascinating having a first-hand account of someone going through that, because I was only 2 when he passed away. So I didn't live through that. But another part of it was when he talked about how it would impact his friends and his family, particularly his mother.
Yeah.
That really got me. So how did you find working once again so closely with such an emotive story?
I think, in a funny way, what I quite liked about this is the sense in which he grew increasingly close to his mother as he and she became older. And so earlier on, there was a sense that he was the black sheep in the family, off to live this theatre life, this gay life in New York. And then later on, particularly after his father died, he became really close to his mother, and he spent a lot of time with her in her house at Auckland and Meadowbank, putting things to rights and working in the garden.
Yeah.
And so that was touching, but in a good way. I think that sense where family became more important to him later on, particularly his mother. He had an interesting relationship with many of his extended family who were rural, relatively conservative people. And so he talks about that in quite a vivid kind of way. I think the way that urban labour New Zealand, as represented in the arts, was very different from rural national New Zealand, which was more about a focus on, I guess, work and home and extended family. And so there's quite a vivid political sense and a real sense of New Zealand society. And this is one of the main themes of his work, is what does it mean to be a New Zealander? What does it mean to be a suburban New Zealander? He was really fascinated with suburbia and small town life, as you'd imagine, because he grew up there. There's one play called Balance of Payments, which is just about my favourite, I think, and that's set in suburbia, and the parents talk the language of finance and banking. And then the mother kills her son with a knitting needle after he refuses to bring back enough money from being a rent boy. I mean, it's just incredible, really. It's a great piece of work. But his father talked the language of banking the entire time. And Robert talks about going on holiday, going, oh, God, I wish my father would stop with the banking.
Yeah.
And so the way he would draw his kind of suburban life into his plays, I thought was really, really interesting. But at the same time, there was a sympathy for his family. At the same time, he was drawing on them relentlessly in terms of his own inspiration.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because to me, I feel like the diaries embodied more of a personal narrative with a sprinkling of social commentary, whereas the plays are more arguably a social commentary.
Totally.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you look at plays like his most well-known is Joyful and Triumphant, his final play that was put on after he died, and it gave him Playwright of the Year. And that play deals with things like politics and ageing and family issues and Māori Pākehā relations. And there's one character, Raewyn, who's involved in a relationship with a woman for a time, but is mostly involved in relationships with men. Issues around suburban respectability, conformity, family ritual, and it's all kind of bound up in this kind of way. And my other favourite play is Bert and Maisie, which is a great piece of work. That's again set in a small town. It's basically about a married couple. And Bert, obviously, and Maisie, obviously. And Bert goes looking for interesting people at the local railway station and then brings them home. And one of them is Tom, and Tom is both a character in his own right and also a cipher for what happens when you start to mess around with the rules of respectability and propriety in small town life. And so Tom, he's travelled a lot, he's very urbane, he drinks wine, not beer, coffee, not tea. He gets Bert in the kitchen and Maisie out in the garden, and he paints their house in bright colours. And he's someone who challenges the kind of norms of New Zealand suburbia of the 1970s. And in response, Grant, who's the nephew-in-law, who's a very conservative, upright insurance broker, bit of a flash Harry, and Grant says, well, I presume that Tom and Bert met in the toilets in the railway station. So Tom represents a kind of a queering of suburbia, even though he's not there's nothing else to suggest that he's queer or Bert is, but there's that sense in which upending the rules of social respectability brands you an outsider, both Tom and Bert. And originally, that play was called A Hint of Scandal.
Yeah, and you mentioned about, the bringing the queerness to suburbia. So I'm assuming like bringing queerness to whatever aspect of life he's discussing as a theme throughout the majority of his plays.
I would say that's right. I think it's a theme throughout the majority of his plays. There are some plays where the outsider theme is really light. So his first play, It Isn't Cricket, which is a group of people on stage kind of basically arguing with each other. And the only real hint is that one guy talks about being trapped in his life. So there's an allusion to not quite being able to live the life that you want to, right? So that's the least queer. And then that goes right the way through plays where men are in domestic relationships with one another, plays where one man's a red boy. There's another play, Meeting Place, which I think is essentially about queerness. I think that's the underlying theme. And a man and a woman are in a relationship. The woman's got a very close friendship with another woman, and the man's got a fraught relationship with another man. The play also includes a gay bashing, and there are references to being disconnected from oneself, and all these themes that you can read through a very queer lens. And then later plays where it's even more overt, China Wars, where there are two heterosexual couples, and there are insinuations that practically everyone is queer. The two women have an affair with one another for a while. The man attracts attention. One of the men attracts attention from another man in the changing rooms in a dress shop. There's another guy. The other main male character is alluded to be having sex with a paper boy in the garden shed. There's basically, I could go on for hours and I won't, but yeah, there's an awful lot of queerness in these plays, and then there are the plays that were never put on, some of which are even queerer.
I mean, a man ahead of his time, right? A little bit of queer in everyone.
A little bit of queer in everyone. And I think I think Robert was personally and intellectually interested in that idea that came out of both gay liberation and the whole Wellington milieu of the early 1970s, where no one was completely gay and no one was completely straight. And so that notion of people swapping and flexing sexuality and mutable sexuality that's become more popular now, but actually had a real moment in the early 1970s. Robert himself was engaged for a very short period of time. His relationships after that were almost exclusively with men, as far as I can tell, but he was interested in that idea. So his characters often swap places, and someone who's looks to be gay then appears to be straight, and someone who appears to be very straight ends up wearing a dress. And so there's a kind of a constant kind of swapping in which queerness happens on a number of different levels, I suppose. Some plays are more coded than others. But as far as I know, there wasn't a lot of queer playwriting going on in New Zealand. There was Gordon Dryland, who was a bisexual playwright who went to live in Australia, wrote a play called If She Brought Me the Wool, which was about the kind of fluidity of relationships in New Zealand in the early 1970s. And then I think the next one that people talk about was Blood of the Lamb by Bruce Mason in about 1979, 1980. But in between those two things, Robert Lord had written about 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or something plays that had queerness in them. So he really is the kind of not quite appreciated gay playwright of that period in New Zealand's history, I think. He didn't see himself as a gay playwright. He saw himself as gay and a playwright, but not those two things as one kind of thing. And yet I think his contribution is incredibly, incredibly interesting, and very much influenced by his time in New York, which we have to talk a little bit about New York.
Okay, let's talk about New York.
Okay, so Robert went to the US in 1974. And he went to a playwright conference in Waterford, Connecticut, a very well-known playwrights conference. And then he decided to live overseas. He thought he might live in Sydney and he thought he might live in London, but he actually got pretty hooked into life in New York, and he lived in Manhattan, very central. He had a dog called Becky, whom he adored, and walked around the place the whole time. And there are photos of Becky all over the place, including in the book.
She's very cute.
Becky is very cute, Becky the Beagle. And he became involved in the playwriting circuit and with a lot of creative people who he said were often kind of unemployed or underemployed, so they had lots of time to kind of hang around and talk about things and smoke weed and a variety of other drugs. And when we did the index, we realised there were quite a lot of different drugs in that index. So they did this. And then the parties, which is where Bowie comes in, and Iggy Pop, both of whom were at parties that Lord went to. He was reasonably well connected in the scene. He got to know people quite well who were up-and-comers. The most famous is probably, other than Bowie, would be Meryl Streep, who acted in one of his early play workshops, a play called Dead and Never Call Me Mother, a predecessor of which was incredibly queer. Maybe I'll talk about that some other time. But he spent a lot of time on Fire Island, leading a very gay life with people he knew out there, and he became very, very close to a circle of men, two of whom I know a bit about, but neither of whom lives anymore. One of whom is Gary Liss, who Robert called Granny, and they would have lunch every Friday, and they would go and watch slides of Singapore at Granny's house, and they would read depressing poetry, and Granny would snort cocaine, and they would go to parties and gossip endlessly. And the other friend who I think is particularly notable was a guy called Jay Funk, who had been lovers with Robert in the 1970s, and they stopped being lovers more or less, but not entirely. And they were very close and had this quite fractious relationship, a really interesting relationship. But as Robert later said, when he was the one running around in a flap the day before he left for New Zealand, it was Jay who would go to Bloomies and work with him to buy presents for his nieces and nephews and that kind of stuff. And, Jay's a good man. He said Jay went off for a while to be a Christian missionary. I don't think he went very far afield. He went as far as Kansas, as far as I know. And then later on, I discovered after doing a bit of ferreting around that Jay became an AIDS activist. And so he took his zeal for evangelising from one setting to another.
Wow.
And then died of AIDS some years later. But Alex Ely, who provided some beautiful photos for us, it turns out had been Jay's flatmate for most of Jay's life. They were best friends at school, he and Jay, and Alex and Robert were quite close. So there was quite a tight-knit group of people. Jack Hopsis, who went on to be a quite well-known movie director, Joyce Reeling, who's a well-known actor, and a number of others, some of whom we had to use pseudonyms for, one of whom who became Sally in the book. And the reason for that is some of the stories are a little bit racy, and I'm not going to give too much away, but Sally has a kind of a sex toy malfunction at one point.
It was very good.
And there are others who porn star who he got to know and hooked up with him and met several years later. And then there were a couple of other stories from Sally. And so we ended up doing pseudonyms for some people because we didn't want to lose the story. But we also didn't want to breach anyone's privacy either, but the stories were too good to tell. So the New York portion of the diaries, or at least the early portion from about 1981 to 1983, these remind me very, very much of Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City books, which was about gay San Francisco at the same time. It turns out that Robert was a really big Armistead Maupin fan, and so he may well have modelled them somewhat on that. So instead of San Francisco and Maupin, we've got New York and Fire Island and parties in Greenwich Village and parties out on the island, and there are a couple of photos from that period. So it's a really rich and interesting life in New York, which posed a massive contrast to New Zealand at that same period. The small, contained society of New Zealand, as Robert put it in one.
Yeah, and he kind of talks about almost a schizophrenic element of personality. He's like, do I belong in New York or do I belong in New Zealand? I don't really belong in either.
Yeah.
And so it was actually really quite interesting and entertaining to have that juxtaposition between the two cities and how they kind of blurred, or two countries rather, and how they blurred.
Absolutely. And he's got these wonderful accounts of flying between the two and reassessing his life in relation to the two as he's going from one to another, and then running into New Zealanders in LA airport, and then thinking about what that means in terms of being a New Zealander and what do I like and what don't I like about New Zealand. And he could never let New Zealand go, really, and in the end he really wanted to be in his cottage in Titan Street in Dunedin. And so that was the happy place for him near the end of his life. And as you mentioned, the cottage is still there. It's a writer's cottage and it has open days occasionally. So he in the end, I think, decided that New York had done as good as it could do for him, and was keen to come back to New Zealand. And certainly supporting his mother in Auckland was part of it too. So I think that real juxtaposition is such an incredibly powerful part of the book. He's got an extended holiday in New Zealand with his parents in 1981, and he talks about going from Auckland through the central North Island and down to the South Island and around, and how he feels about New Zealand as he's doing it, as well as saying his father's talking too much about banking every leg of the holiday. And so I think there's a sense he gets drunk in Lake Oho with a series of bus drivers and shearers and others. And there's the most hilarious description of, it might be the bus drivers pretending to shear each other and pretending each other's sheep, and then pulling their pants down and pretending they're not noticing, and this incredibly amazing kind of homoerotic thing happening in the bottom of the South Island.
I mean, we could spend hours talking about that, because I loved it, especially when he talked about the fact that one of the shearers was like, I'll teach you how to shear. I'm like, oh, will you, sir?
And then he asks for my phone number or my address or something like that.
Yeah, it was just so good.
And you could see that he was thoroughly charmed by this episode, as well as seeing it as a New Zealand thing, shearers, sheep, pub in a settlement where there's not a lot else probably there, and this sense of just being kind of wildly amused by the barman brushing his teeth with a toilet brush and then everyone pretending to shear one another. I mean, I think that's kind of wonderful. And there's my other favourite bit from that trip is where he talks about ending up in Ratahi or somewhere in the North Island, and there's just fields of carrots everywhere. And then there's a theatre standing in a main street that's got like 3 shops in it. It's like, what is this doing here? That kind of incongruity of the theatre and the carrots, right? So you get this incredibly wonderful kind of New Zealandness comes through. And then the next diary is back in New York and in Fire Island and stuff. And you think, man, what must that have been like to be living a life in 2 halves like that?
Absolutely. I mean, immediately I thought, there's so much travel, so much admin.
So much admin. And I don't really know how he afforded the airfares, because he was never particularly well off.
No.
This was not a lucrative game at all.
No. Yeah, it was very interesting. But again, we don't want to give too much away, because we want people to buy the book and enjoy it for themselves.
That's right, we do. Yes.
We do. And so if people were interested in buying the book, where can they get it from?
UBS and just online through Otago University Press. Most bookshops will have it.
As they should.
But let's support the 2 local things, OUP and UBS.
Absolutely. Well, to prevent us talking for hours about this, because it sounds like we could, we should end it here. But yes, go visit University of Otago Press and the University Bookshop. Buy this fabulous book. And if you see us, talk about it, because it's amazing. Thanks, Chris.